Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome back after needing to cancel last week. Thank you for your flexibility, although we're excited that we won't actually fully cancel Paul Greenberg's talk, so we'll get to hear him at the very end of the class. This week we have Elizabeth Yeampierre, who I will introduce in just a minute after some initial announcements. We're especially excited, although Miss Jerry's not here so we might have to do it again. But we're especially excited to announce that Oakland Avenue Farm, where Miss Jerry is the executive director, won the Farmer of the Year award from the Michigan Family Farmers Conference this year, which is a really huge honor. We have a handful of announcements. UMSFP, the University of Michigan Sustainable Food Program, has some leadership team jobs, 4 different jobs. Is anybody in the room from UMSFP that could speak about this later? Raise your hand. Way in the back in purple. Please stay afterwards. If any of you are interested in these jobs for students in the room, please speak to them afterwards. UMSFP is basically an umbrella student organization that is the leadership group for a dozen or so student-led food systems organizations on campus. They do amazing work, so if you're at all excited to get more deeply involved in food systems work, working for them and actually getting paid would be a really great opportunity. There's also a job opening for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Student Manager at the campus farm. This is in addition to that other job that we announced a couple of weeks ago. So lots of great job opportunities. If you're interested in that, write the campus farm at umich.edu. And the campus farm has a really interesting new initiative this year called the Produce Pickup. This is about affordable campus farm produce for sale for the students, by the students. So if you're interested in that, you can write the same email I just mentioned before, which is campusfarm@umich.edu, if you want to learn more about trying to get healthy food grown by students at affordable rates delivered to you somewhere here on Central Campus. And then finally, there's an exciting talk coming up next week, next Wednesday. It's Paul Saginaw, who's a partner and co-founder of Zingerman's, and Eileen Spring, who's the president of Food Gatherers, 2 amazing, interesting organizations in our pillars of our community. They're both great speakers, and they're going to be speaking about something called Food for Thought, how 2 local leaders cultivated mindful careers in the specialty food and food bank sectors. And that's going to be next Wednesday, 5:30 p.m. in Weiser Hall in the 10th floor. Free and open to the public, also not just students. Finally, specifically related to our course, we need to always thank our sponsors because we couldn't carry this off without them. We especially want to lift up the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies tonight. They were major contributors to bringing Elizabeth Yeampierre tonight. Also the School of Environment and Sustainability, Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Center for Engaged in Academic Learning, the Center for the Education of Women, and Francis and Sydney Lewis Visiting Leaders Fund, Seed Wayne at Wayne State University, School of Public Health, and the Urban and Regional Planning Program of Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. Thank you all again to our sponsors. Just as a reminder for community members in the room that are not taking this course for credit, if this is your first time, hopefully you RSVP'd before you came. In the future, please RSVP. If you just go to Food Literacy for All, you'll find this RSVP page and can let us know. And we also just want to learn a little bit more about who's coming to these events, so we ask you to fill out just a few brief questions. Shuttles. Our next shuttle will be March 12th from Detroit for Anna LePay's talk. And again, you can still catch a ride from Detroit, also with Mama Jerry, if you prefer. So, Elizabeth Yeampierre is an internationally recognized Puerto Rican attorney and environmental and climate justice movement leader. She was born and raised in New York City, and she's won numerous awards that I can't show you on a clicker question. She's spoken about climate justice in local, national, and international forums, including the first White House Forum on Environmental Justice under the Obama administration. And she's been featured by many media outlets, including The Guardian, Al Jazeera, the Huffington Post, and many others. Since 1996, she's served as executive director of UPROSE, Brooklyn's oldest Latino community-based environmental justice organization. In recent years, much of UPROSE's focus has been on helping Sunset Park, the neighborhood where the organization is located, recover from Hurricane Sandy through what one report described as a deeply democratic, holistic approach that builds local power and increases community control over resources. UPROSE also spearheaded the campaign #OurPowerPRNYC, which is supported by a coalition of over 25 groups and organizations in New York City that's demanding a just recovery in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. This includes the Climate Justice Alliance, which Ms. Yeampierre co-chairs, which is a national coalition of grassroots organizations addressing the impact of climate change on frontline communities of color, based on a collective decision-making process and just transitions away from our current fossil fuel economy. Actions of the campaign have included working with Greenpeace to bring a ship full of supplies to Puerto Rico, demanding that Puerto Rico's debt be canceled, and organizing a number of protests. In interviews, Ms. Yeampierre has pointed out how Puerto Rico's recovery must integrate food sovereignty, economic sovereignty, and energy democracy. We're incredibly privileged to hear more about her tireless work and insights around these and other issues at a moment when climate justice is needed in so many of our communities. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Yeampierre. I already told them the answer. So this was my question. But it's the University of Michigan Professional Achievement Award in Environmental Justice, which I think we should create because it doesn't exist, to give her. The other awards that she's won are she was named one of the top 100 green leaders by Poder Hispanic Magazine, the Asian Americans for Equality Dream of Equality Award, La Federación Nacional de Pioneros Puertorriqueños Award, and the American Planning Association Paul Davidoff Award, which probably none of you have ever heard of, but I'm an urban planner, and I know that's a big deal of an award. And that's one of very many awards that's really exciting to see. Cool.
Buenas tardes, mi gente. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. It's always uncomfortable to hear your bio read. I have to say that my favorite award really was probably the one from the Pioneros, which were these elders that did it in their backyard with real arroz con andule and pernil, and I just felt like a lot of love from my community, and there isn't anything that makes you feel better than knowing that that you're honoring the legacy of struggle of your people, because that's what I come from. And so what my bio doesn't tell you about me is that I am my mother's most melanin challenged child of African and Indigenous ancestry, that I grew up and that we grew up in an environmental justice community in the midst of brown fields and apartments that were laced with lead. Really sort of exposed to all of the toxics and toxicants that you find in environmental justice communities all over the country. That the Puerto Rican community is a descendant of extraction, the extraction of our labor and the extraction of our land, and that climate justice that climate change is also a descendant of that extraction. And so I wanted to have an opportunity to have a conversation with you today, and I approach you with a lot of humility. I love the city of Detroit. when we were organizing for the People's Climate March in 2014. If you've looked up the People's Climate March and you see that front line is made up of young people of color mostly from my organization. Our organization is intergenerational. We believe that leadership is a continuum and that you exercise leadership throughout. We think that you learn across the table, and that adult-led, that youth-led is just as toxic as adult-led. That when you're talking about youth-led, you're really talking about an extractive, competitive process that marginalizes and pushes elders out. And that when you're talking about adult-led, you're talking about also holding on to your power and not sharing. And we're living in this moment where we have to be leaderful, and leaderful because that's what climate change demands of us. And we also have to respect frontline leadership. And we need to make sure that we are intergenerational, because if we are not building power in a way that is really authentically intergenerational, we will fail. And so there's a lot that we have to do that is radically different than what has been done up until now. The sad part is that people had a minute to learn how to engage in just relationships, how to engage in self-transformation, how to make a commitment to anti-racism. They had a lot of time to do that, and they didn't do it. And the people that we depend on to come into our organizations or who want to helicopter into our communities to speak for our people, they haven't done it either. And so I believe that at the end of doing everything that we possibly can to address climate change, whether we put in infrastructure on the ground, whether we do any of that, if we don't fix this problem in terms of building just relationships, that we will fail. And so regardless of what you know about planning, what you know about civics, what you know about decision making, what you know about infrastructure, about reducing carbon, if you can't get that one thing right, we will fail. So it's a terrible way to start a conversation, right? But I did want to come because, so with the People's Climate March, we organized a march of over 400,000 people. And if you saw the opening of the march, you saw the sunflowers. And we made a conscious decision from Brooklyn to open with the sunflowers out of solidarity with the city of Detroit. We felt that the BK was the sister city of the city of Detroit, and because Detroit was fighting for water, we wanted to be able to lift that because we had, as one of the lead organizers, the opportunity to open the march. And so that sunflower has become iconic for climate justice all over the country. In this past year, you've seen wildfires in California, Hurricane Harvey in Houston, Superstorm Sandy in New York. It wasn't even a hurricane, it was a superstorm, right? Katrina in the Gulf South, a deep, deep freeze right here that seemed like the day after tomorrow. At least when I was on the phone with Tom Goldtooth last week and we were talking about, oh my God, it's so cold in New York, being Caribbean, if it just dips below 32, I'm suffering. And he's like, well, I'm in Minnesota. And I was like, okay, enough said, enough said. So, to Hurricane Maria, which basically hit my beloved Puerto Rico, the oldest colony in the world, and an example of how disaster becomes an economic opportunity for disaster capitalists. We didn't just see that happening in Puerto Rico, and is happening in Puerto Rico, where we believe that by next year, 500,000 people will be pushed out and the island emptied out to make it possible for disaster capitalists to take a strong foothold in Puerto Rico. We also saw that in the Gulf South, where we've seen historical Black communities that are descendants of slaves that literally suffered from austerity and neglect the way they have in Puerto Rico. Those communities moved to Houston, where they were then impacted by Hurricane Irma, right? And those communities that they came from now have environmental amenities, they have transportation amenities, and they have all of those amenities for privileged people who have moved in to these communities, where they are now redefining what music from New Orleans should sound like and what the food should taste like, literally sucking out not only the soul of New Orleans, but basically making it impossible for those people to ever come back to their homes. So when we're thinking about how we address climate change, we need to be thinking about it in a lot of different ways. I refer to everyone around here as food people. I'm not a food person. I come from the climate justice movement. And so food is an integral part of that movement. But I focus on community building, on infrastructure, on governance, things that are going to be disrupted by climate change. In New York City, for example, the subway system, the biggest, most populated subway system in the world, was underwater after Superstorm Sandy. And so when I envision and when I think about what happens in our communities, I think, what if government fails? What if there are so many extreme weather events happening that people are not going to be able to take care of themselves locally? What does governance look like there? What does a local livable economy look like? How do we build economies of scale? How do we engage in a just transition, right? My organization, we organize the largest gathering of young people of color on climate change. We've doubled the amount of open space. We've stopped the siting of a power plant. We've brought in transportation amenities that our elders have asked us for. And just in the last 2 weeks, announced the launch of the first community-owned solar cooperative in the state of New York. And I share that with you because while we're thinking about this, we're thinking about 4 other community-owned solar initiatives that we have, and we have questions about what does governance look like in that, and what does that look like in perpetuity, as we know that a lot of the environmental amenities that we've brought to our community have resulted in our own displacement. That when we stop the siting of power plants, when we clean up brownfields, when we basically green up our neighborhood, we basically push our own people out. We make it attractive to people who have always had everything and always want everything. And that kind of thing happens not just in terms of the fact that people of privilege benefit from the sweat and the sacrifice of people who could have made other choices. Those of us in our communities that are exercising leadership and that are building, we could have done other things, right? We chose to stay in our neighborhoods. We chose to reclaim our community. We chose to train people to own their power. And to actually spend your life doing that, to then see your people displaced, is something that keeps people up at night. It is really, really painful. And the other side of that, a lot of you have heard about the IPCC report. And the IPCC report was really troubling, not just because they're saying that we've got 12 years to get it right, or recurrent extreme catastrophe is heading our way, as if somehow losing over 5,000 Puerto Ricans is not a catastrophe, or 12,000 Filipinos in 2012, because people forgot about the Filipinos, by the way. It's like, if you're not in the media, you're in the media for a second, and once the media has moved on to the next thing, it doesn't even matter. I think about Haiti, I think about the Philippines, I think about the fact that a tornado just landed in Santiago de Cuba. I think about those things all the time. And so I'm also thinking about, how do we build a momentum and how do we build a movement that is strong, that builds a groundswell without doing it on the backs of the front line. And so even the organizations and the funders in our communities, the organizations that sort of helicopter in, are a problem after the IPCC. So the IPCC report comes out and people freak out. Oh my God, the world is coming to an end. My generation is going to be the most impacted. You know what? The front line, people of color, the people least responsible for creating climate change, the global south, are the people that are going to be most impacted. And so this is an issue that really we have to lead. And so it's really important for you to be aware that because you think personally that it's a crisis, doesn't mean that you get to then helicopter into communities that are already doing the work. And what we saw the IPCC report do was that people suddenly started literally running roughshod over the Hermes principles for democratic organizing. Principles that they had agreed to as a result of all the building that we have been doing. We've been trying to build alignment, right? And we've been trying to build alignment because we think that we need to have movements that complement each other. Think about it for a second. Our communities don't have a choice between going out to a rally on police brutality and going out to one on climate change. We have always lived at the intersection of all of the isms, and they and we don't have the luxury to just work on one issue, air quality, water quality, infrastructure. We have to work on all of those. And meantime, a lot of the organizations that have resources, they could really bring in folks into our communities that we're happy to work with as partners. What we are not happy to do is to engage in what I call climate colonialism, climate missionaries, or people coming into our communities for the climate selfie, or the climate Beckies. Oh, I have a lot of climate words. And the reason I use them and the reason why I'm disrespectful is because I feel that our community's leadership, the fact that people in their communities have the solutions and are doing the work, that is being supplanted. Local decision making is being supplanted, leadership is being supplanted, and people are happy to support that. So even now, after the IPCC report came out, where you would have thought that a lot of mainstream white-led organizations would have done some landscaping and thought about where are the gaps? Where do we need to come in to start building a groundswell of support? Which are the communities that are in the margins that are not engaged in the climate fight? How do we get them engaged? Maybe we should be thinking creatively about those red states. One would think that if people really care about climate change, that landscaping would be taking place, and that people will be figuring out, okay, so these are the people that are doing this work in the Bay, these are the folks that are doing it in Brooklyn, and these are the people who are doing it in Detroit. But instead, what you find is that everyone makes a beeline for the communities where people of color are leading on environmental justice and climate justice. Everyone comes in with deep resources that we don't get to supplant local decision making instead of trying to figure out how do we share resources and power, how do we build alignment, how do we complement each other, and how do we work strategically so that we have a powerful base. That is not happening. That is not happening because to do that would mean hard work, but to come into communities where the work is already being done, that's easy, that's lazy. And climate change demands something more than that. And so when we see new groups emerging and we ask, what does your tour around the country look like? We find out that they're coming to our communities. And you know what that means? That means like the people in Seattle and the folks out in Miami, that means we have to stop what we're doing to engage people, to talk to them about the James Principles for Democratic Organizing, how you build just relationships and engage in self-transformation, how you check your privilege, how you can do work that maybe we're not doing. We have to literally stop to engage people who feel entitled to speak for our communities. So if you care about climate change, how many people care about climate change and are concerned? Oh my God, is there anybody here who doesn't? Oh no. Okay, you scared me for a second there. If you care about that, you want to be engaged in building intergenerational relationships. For people whose traditions are of African and Indigenous ancestry, we have always been intergenerational. Our young people honor elders, and our elders shouldn't get in the way. If I'm in a meeting where, and this happens often, I go into the office and I think that I'm brilliant and I have this great idea, and a 17-year-old says, well, what about this? And I'm like, okay, all right, that's what we do. We have to address this issue with tremendous amount of humility, and we need to be open to bringing in all the local brilliance that exists. Remember that people without have always lived sustainably. We've always had to reuse, repurpose, and recycle. There's nothing more sustainable than a person who comes from struggle. So the solutions really are local. In this country, we no longer know how to make things, but people in our communities know how to fix things. They know how to recycle things. They know how to live in a way that honors Mother Earth. So you could learn about how to build infrastructure that brings bioswales into the community. You can talk about permeable surfaces and where that has to be built. And we talk about all those things. We're in the largest significant maritime industrial area in New York City, which is now being turned into a commercial sector instead of building for New York City's climate adaptation needs and future, right? So we're having those conversations. But at the end, the thing that's most important to me is how you come into a space and how you build relationships and how we build a movement, because literally time is up and people really did have a minute to learn how to engage in a way that honored people from the front line and that treated them as equals. And so when I have someone in my organization come in and reach out and says, "Oh my God, you're so smart, where are you from?" And I just smile because, well, we're a bunch of badasses, right? And I gotta own that. I gotta own that because we're here, because we exist. And when I think about my grandmother having lost half her children to hunger and disease because of U.S. economic policies that put her in one of the poorest parts of Puerto Rico, I come from that. And so I have to believe that I owe something to her legacy. And I fight like I owe something to her legacy. And so I study and I approach everything with humility, and there is nothing in the way of us embracing people who are brilliant and have good ideas. But I say that with an understanding that the issue of race at the core of how we come into these spaces is something that you can't ignore if you care about climate change. You can't talk about climate change without talking about race. When I think about extreme weather events, I think about martial law. I think about more policing. I think about what the police did in Puerto Rico, where they basically had people in lockdown in their own homes. And I think about what that means for young men of color in my community, and how climate change and extreme weather events will become an excuse for further locking up people in our community. Just a few weeks ago, there was a federal prison in my neighborhood where the inmates, our incarcerated family, had no heat or hot water, and we only found out because they were rapping on the windows. So that happens in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, just a few weeks ago. You could Google it, right? So, but when we think about climate change, we don't think about our families that are incarcerated. We don't think about the homeless that are mostly people of color if you're in an urban area like New York City. We don't think about any of those folks. We think about what is going to happen to us. And so we need to be able to get past what is going to happen to me to what is going to happen to our community. Because in every block in an urban area, there's that busybody who knows all your business. She knows when you're hooking up. She knows if you're on dialysis. She knows if you have diabetes. She is your first responder. She's in the window. She's watching you. And that's power. That's local community power. That's social cohesion. And when displacement threatens that social cohesion, we're more vulnerable to extreme weather events and to disaster. And when there's disaster in our communities, we lose the opportunity to ever come back to them. So I believe that we can do this. I think it's happening in my community where everybody is now about climate justice. I think it's happening in Detroit. I think it's happening in Philly. It's happening in Boston. It's happening in Miami. It's happening in the Bay. It's happening in Indian country. People are engaged in putting infrastructure on the ground, on strengthening social cohesion, on fighting displacement, racial violence, all of it, right? Because we've been doing it for a long time. And we can do it better and we can go deeper if we do it in a way that's broader but is anchored in just transitions and is anchored in building just relationships. So I saw a sign go up, so I don't know if I went over. I'm good? Oh damn, I'm good. All right. So I was trying to speed it up. So what are the things that we're seeing as a result of climate change? We're seeing the privatization of our schools, of our infrastructure. We're seeing land grabs, the privatization of transit. We're basically seeing a deepening of our colonialism, right? You're seeing it in Puerto Rico. You saw it in the Gulf South. We're seeing it in communities all over the country. And so what is going to happen is that government is going to move away from its responsibility to addressing the needs of the most vulnerable as you see the privatization of infrastructure and the things that basically the glue that holds communities together. You're probably seeing that in Detroit. I don't know if you're seeing that in Ann Arbor, but I'm thinking that, I remember the first time I went to Detroit and I thought, oh my God, this is a beautiful black city. and one of the remaining black cities in the United States, because we're seeing Brooklyn go. Brooklyn's gone, right? We're seeing, Philly go. We've seen Oakland go. We're losing all of these historical black cities. And when I talk about black, I'm not talking about African American. I always talk about the African diaspora. And that's for me important as a Puerto Rican, because I think that as people of the African diaspora, one of the things that I learned is that nationality is something that was created through colonialism, and that the ship stopped in a lot of different places, right? Those things are important. The issue of immigration when it comes to and migration is also important to climate change. And even when we talk about immigration, we need to be really careful, because we always think of immigration as being a brown issue, but immigration is also a black issue. And even people who are immigrant activists need to think about their narrative, because often immigrants say, well, we built this country and we work. Those two things trigger people. They trigger people because, no, you didn't build this country. This country was basically built on land that was indigenous, and it was built by black people, and you have sustained this country over time. And so even sharing the narrative makes people more powerful, and is really important that you think about the language that you use. The other thing that's also triggering is when people say, we work. And then those of us who are not immigrants, right? Because I'm Puerto Rican and we became citizens in 1917, just in time for World War I. That was intentional for World War I. Is the subtext to that is that some of us don't? Because in New York City, the two populations that are lagging behind every single racial and ethnic group, including new immigrants, are blacks and Puerto Ricans. And what they have in common is the fact that they've been colonized in this country. African Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Native Americans have a lot of similar socioeconomic indicators. So for us to even build, it means that we need to challenge the way that we think about things and the way that we talk about things. The collection of data, when you are collecting data to talk about disparate impacts and to talk about vulnerabilities, when we talk about data and we use terms like Hispanic is absolutely meaningless. I don't know what a Hispanic is, other than the fact that maybe it's somebody who speaks Spanish, or maybe it was someone who was colonized by Spain. There is a vast difference between a Puerto Rican, a Cuban, a Dominican, a Mexican, some are from Uruguay, Argentina. Some Latinos are not even people of color. Being a Latino does not make somebody a person of color. You could be a person of privilege, right? You might not have any African and Indigenous ancestry. You're no different than someone who's British or somebody who's French. And in France, they don't keep data on race at all, but that's a conversation for another day, right? So it's really important that even in collecting data, you really don't know what the vulnerabilities are, what the susceptibility to disease is in the event of an extreme weather event, if you don't know anything about that particular group of people, if you haven't done the research to go that deep. And that's important. So you can't put immigrants in a big category because there's differences between all of the groups. And Hispanic is a congressionally created term. I don't know what happened with that one, but I have no idea what a Hispanic is. And so I like knowing what people are, because when we know what people are, we know how to organize. In my community, there is an Asian community that is largely Fujian. And the Fujian community is really socioeconomically neck and neck with other people of color in that community. So the assumptions that people have about the Asian community in Sunset Park are completely wrong. But I know because I know they're Fujian. In my community, there are people from Palestine and people from Yemen. And I know the histories of those groups. And then there's all the Central American groups, the Mexicans that are mostly from Puebla. So I know about that. That local knowledge makes it impossible for you to use that culture as a way of building, not only building power, but building on climate adaptation, coming up with solutions to address climate change, because each of those groups has solutions that are really important that we can all benefit from. And those things are things that you celebrate. Difference is something to be celebrated. And it makes us stronger. So I think that we have a tendency to do what's easy, which is to lump people in big giant categories that make no sense, and then wonder why our solutions are not working on a very local scale. Even in one community, one block is very different than another. On one block, you may have Section 8 housing or NYCHA if you're in New York. On another block, you may have auto salvaging shops. And while you're addressing climate change, you also have to think about small businesses, those mom and pop shops that are being pushed out. In our organization, what we're trying to do is we're trying to train them to be climate adaptable, to learn how to containerize their chemicals so that they're safe in the event of an extreme weather event. An environmentalist would push them out and say that these auto salvaging shops are dropping chemicals and creating brownfields. Well, these are people who don't have a formal education, but they know how to fix a car, and they don't even know that they're exposing themselves, not only to fugitive dust and to chemicals, but to possible, if something goes flying, right, in the middle of your face when there's high winds, right? So the idea is to think about where people are and what they need and to ask them what they need and to approach them in a way that's respectful. And so we work with auto salvaging shops and we work with small businesses to try to bring them along so that they move away from the kinds of containers that are really toxic. So from the very granular on the very local scale to the national scale where we basically looked at the Green New Deal and said, wait a minute. You mean you're moving with the grass tops and that the front line is not centered? And that you have nothing here about just transitions and that you're talking about things like nuclear and you're talking about carbon sequestration and carbon capture? So from the very local level to the statewide, where in New York State, we're basically pushing to make New York State 100% renewable, and then across the country. And none of that happens from one person with a great idea or one little organization that thinks it has all the answers. All of that comes from a movement, from the collective, from the brilliance of people from different parts of the country coming together, sharing in a leaderful community where one person isn't an iconic leader. We have been trained and conditioned to believe that there's one person that you follow, right? Like in the 60s and the 70s. But this is not the 60s and the 70s. And when there's that one person that you follow, you can always take that person out. But the climate justice movement is leaderful, and it's mostly women of color who run it. And we wear big earrings. I just want to say that. It's really important to us. So I'm going to stop. I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to thank you for your love, and I want to thank you for your commitment to Mother Earth. And I hope that your heart was open so that you could hear where my heart is coming from. I do think that we're in the middle of in a moment of crisis, and I think that this is a moment that really requires that we all be our best selves and that we get out of our comfort zones and work with each other in a way that we've never worked with each other before. It means dismissing everything that we've learned and really relearning what it's like to be a decolonized person. I think that that's what it's going to take. So I send you de Acocan mucho amor. Gracias. Okay.
So in case your clickers were turned off during that time, we decided to give you a long break so you forgot the answers that I might have quickly shown you. Okay. So if your clicker is off, again, hold the power button down until it flashes and then push BB.
All right, so the first question is, which one of the following is not one of the Jimenez principles for democratic organizing? Because I know you looked it up. A, emphasis on bottom-up organizing. B, let people speak for themselves. C, consensus on every decision. C, commitment to self-transformation. It's like a game show. Yay, C, that's right. All right, give yourselves a hand. What? All right, next one. It's the first time I'm doing this. Okay, just transition. I know you looked this up too. And the just transition principles can be found on the Climate Justice Alliance website. Or you can go to Movement Generation, which is a great organization on the West Coast, and they've got a zine, they've got an infographic, they've got all kinds of tools that you can use so that you could look really smart and insert it into your thesis and say, what? This is just transition. So just transition is what? A principle, B, a process, C, a practice, D, all of the above.
There we go. They got it.
Okay, man, that's what's up. All right. Okay, and then,
Wait, hold on.
and then the final and the most important question of the evening. Which of the following is not a reason why frontline women wear big earrings? A, they can be used as a weapon. B, poor taste. C, they challenge patriarchy. D, they put a shine on us. E, adorning is part of our history. This is a very serious question. All right, let's see. I don't see the men as enthusiastic about this as they, what? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. That's awesome. So I think we can open up for questions. I'd rather actually hear what you have to ask and what you have to say than to be speaking up here and as if I were the only expert in the room. This is a room with a lot of brilliance. I can feel your energy. No questions? You're trying to get out early? I came all the way from Brooklyn, and I have limited mobility, so there you go, all the way in the back.
Hi, my name is Meryl. Wait, we do the introduction thing? I'm an environment minor student, but also part of the produce pickup, which was plugged earlier. So I was wondering, I'm a part of a trip that goes to Honduras yearly to work in communities like this, and I've been a part of the talk where volunteerism is a thing and going into communities and kind of disrupting the change that they've been leading. I don't think the trip, I like the way this trip is structured, but I'm just wondering, knowing that and having been a part of that talk, is there a particular organization that you see as a good model for a predominantly like white organization that is going into communities, or not going into communities, but like kind of doing a job and doing it right, as you were talking about?
Yeah, there are. I know that in Puerto Rico, I had graduate students contacting me saying, "Oh my God, I want to do my thesis on this," and I was like, "Oh no." I wouldn't even come to the phone. I was like, wow, what an extractor you are. In New York City, DSA, New York, DSA has a really amazing and respectful way of working with us that really amplifies our work and gives us the kind of support that we need when we need it. They sometimes, because of our limited capacity, we reach out to them, and when we were organizing for the September 20th event for the 1-year anniversary of Hurricane Maria, they literally blanketed communities where we just didn't have the resources or the organizers. And what they do is we have these regular check-ins, and they ask, what do you need? And when we contact them, and it could be anything from helping us with an op-ed piece to doing street organizing to doing door knocking, and we love them. And it's mostly a bunch of white guys, and they're all really tall, I say that because I'm close to the earth. But they, in the beginning, it was a little awkward and uncomfortable. They made mistakes, but they were so open to hearing about how we build these relationships better. And so as a result, what's happened is that we now relying on them on a lot. And even in their advocacy on a national scale, they'll give us language, and they're like, what do you think about this language? I'll give you one specific example. They called themselves the Climate Justice Group or something like that. And I said, no, you're not. And they said, what? No, you're not. You're not frontline led. You don't have I don't even know if you have people of color in your group. So maybe you want to come up with some language. And they had a meeting and they came up with different language and then they announced it. And I remember my husband asking me, did you have something to do with that? I was like, no. And I had nothing to do with it. But the fact that they didn't see it as me rejecting or putting down, it was just sort of like, hey, we really I need to start thinking about power relationships differently and how you use your privilege in a movement so that you lift us and support us so that at the end we'll all be in the same place. They do that in the most respectful way. And there are other groups like them, but I want to use them as an example because I've grown really fond of them and they really have helped us be even more effective. And that's what happens when people build just relationships. No? Yes, and the teal? Teal glasses on your head? It is teal.
It is teal.
Yeah.
I love the earrings, but I love the glasses even more. So just saying.
The real extra.
I love them. Thanks for coming all the way from the Bronx. My name is Sam. Brooklyn. I'm
that's
so
a thing
sorry.
for us. No, that's a thing for us. But I was imported from the Bronx into Brooklyn by my husband. So I got love for the Bronx. South Bronx, Simpson Street, to be exact.
I really liked that you talked about collecting data, and how would you suggest that we do that in a way that's more reflective of diversity and is more celebratory of that, and smaller local groups instead of lumping people so much?
I think everything begins with asking the community what it needs and what it wants and how they want you to come into the space. A lot of our campaigns, really most of our campaigns started with our community telling us they needed something. So like when we stopped when we basically brought back a local bus, it was because our elders said that they wanted the bus. When we expanded the median, it was because they felt like roadkill. We rarely tell the community what's in their best interest. So even accessing data is really putting the tools in the hands of the community so they can access it themselves. So the community really has to be the local scientists. In our organization, our young people get data on PM 2.5, on NOx, on SOx. They do GIS mapping. They're 15 years old and they're doing GIS mapping. I think that even data is something. How do you collect data on somebody who's half this and half that? How do you even report on that, right? And our people are really mixed people. And so one of the people on my staff is Chinese. Her children are half Puerto Rican. We look like Octavia Butler's future, right? That's who we are. That's why we're so cute, right? So how you gather that data really is having a conversation with community and asking them, what are the indicators? What are the things that are important to you? What do you want to know more about? And why do you want to know about that? What kinds of solutions are you looking at? And then you start really sort of developing a body of work around what a survey looks like. What do those questions look like? How do you create baseline data? But it really starts with a conversation about what are the things that are concerning you the most and what do you need to know in order to come up with solutions? And I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of how we did it. With our small businesses, we knew that our small businesses were being attacked by environmentalists, and we knew that, they weren't selling crack in the corner, they were fixing cars, and that they were part of the local economy, that they lived in the neighborhood, and that we didn't want them pushed out. So we had to approach them with a lot of respect and humility and say, what would you like? They're like, well, we don't want the rents to go up, we don't want to be pushed out of here. And we were like, well, maybe some of these things are things that, did you know, for example, that if you touch this chemical, that this chemical is a carcinogen? No, Mama, I didn't know that. So, you have to talk to community in a way that's different, and you start getting a lot of information that then becomes part of a data bank that then you report to the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. And that's what we do. Like literally, we start there, and then scientists take that information and create programs out of that.
Can you share more of your criticism for the Green New Deal? You seemed critical. And can you go into more of your thoughts and feelings surrounding the Green New Deal?
Sure. I don't.
This is, my name is Christine Kwan. I'm from the Eastern Market in Detroit.
I don't think that any activists worth their salt signs a blank slate without finding out what the impacts are for their communities. And so when it came out and it started trending and people thought, ooh, a sexy new shiny toy, our question was, what does that mean for our neighborhoods? What does that mean for our community? Let's take a closer look. And so people were very annoyed with us because they thought we were stopping something that was going to be transformational and powerful when it was so needed, knowing what we knew about climate change. But we needed to take that pause, and we needed to check in with our members all over the country, and we needed to put together a group of people who did then look at it, sit with it, and say, these are the things that are a problem, and this is what a Climate Justice Alliance platform looks like. So when our members put together that platform, that sent a ripple effect throughout the entire nation, where all of a sudden everybody who was just saying yes, yes, yes said, oh, okay. But it did more than that. I know Alexandria, we had a meeting with her and we met with her staff, and what they did was they centered frontline communities in a just transition, which is what they should have done and what they could have done had it not been a grass tops effort to begin with. So my answer to your question is that you can support something while being critical, and you could make it better, you could make it deeper, and you could make it have a system of accountability to frontline people. Right now, every elected official in the freaking world has a Green New Deal agenda, and I promise you that there's a whole lot of them that were never thinking about anything that had to do with the environment, have no history of addressing environmental justice, but think that it's sexy and it's going to get them some play in the media. And so it's important for all of us to stop and look at what's coming out of our communities, whether it's municipal, whether it's statewide, and seeing if that reflects the priorities of our communities. In New York State, for example, Cuomo is talking about the Green New Deal, but you know what? What he's pushing is not what we're pushing, which is CCPA, which is out of the New York Renews Coalition to make New York State 100% renewable and to move 40% of those resources to frontline communities. It's not the same thing. And so what he's using is that language, that hashtag. And so we need to look at that closely. We have a responsibility to do that and not just say, oh, this is awesome. The idea of moving a green agenda across the country is tremendously important, but without justice, it's not about us. And I say that only because even when we talked about a recovery in Puerto Rico, we talked about a just recovery. Because a recovery is basically bringing in, folks to bring, even the word resilience, right? The word resilience means to bounce back. Nobody in my community wants to bounce back to injustice. So you have a disaster, and so people come in and clean up, but you still have police brutality, you still have displacement, you still have nobody wants to bounce back to that. So we think about the word resistance instead of the word resilience because we're talking about how you move forward, right? The Green New Deal is no different in the sense that it is this phrase that can mean a whole lot of things to a whole lot of people. And so it has to be anchored in justice. It has to be anchored in frontline communities and in just transitions. And just transitions were solutions that existed long before the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal kind of started on the West Coast by people I will not mention because we're in a positive head right here. People who really wanted to run roughshod over the environmental justice movement, who were talking about cap and trade and we're talking about markets instead of moving away from fossil fuel. And so in the climate justice movement, what we're talking about is moving away from extraction to a regenerative economy. That's not, the Green New Deal has a lot of cap and trade in there, and you got to look a little closely. And so we can shape it, but shaping it means being critical. And so you have to be critical. But that doesn't mean that we're dismissing, that we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. At least in my view, my humble view. Antonio. open this thing. I'm thirsty.
Could you speak a bit more about what's happening in Puerto Rico right now? Because I think a lot of folks know about Hurricane Maria, but they don't necessarily know about Promesa and emergency management. I mean, same thing in Detroit is in Puerto Rico and Spain, Ireland, Greece, all over the world. And then after that, could you also speak to the rising sort of like right-wing populism, U.S. pushing neoliberal stuff into Latin America, and what that kind of portends for, you know, the environment and the future of Latin America?
I'm gonna try. So about Puerto Rico. So I don't know how much people know in this room about Puerto Rico, but one of the things that I said in my opening remarks is that Puerto Rico is the oldest colony in the world. It has a long history of austerity and neglect. When Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, there were 23 Superfunds in Puerto Rico. If you can imagine an island that tiny with 23 Superfunds, it really has been an object to be exploited by corporations for generations. Puerto Ricans lead in the world on levels of asthma. I know my father died of an asthma attack at the age of 50. I had a bilateral pulmonary embolism about 2 or 3 years ago. Literally, I don't know if it's generational stress or historical trauma or the fact that we have been so deeply colonized that ends up in disease, but there are already a lot of health disparities in Puerto Rico, a lot of people being pushed out before the hurricane hit. I think something like 300,000 had already been pushed out. And then Promesa, which is this corporate board that was created, and some people here can actually talk better about that than I can, that was created to basically further exploit Puerto Rico and take more resources out of a nation that really had nothing left. The universities have been depleted. What we're seeing right now is transit being privatized, the schools being privatized, I don't know if I'm answering your question. I get lost in Puerto Rico in my head because I literally go there and then I just feel this profound sadness to think that after all these years that people are still dying, committing suicide. The suicide rates are 55% higher. They think that by next year about 500,000 people will be pushed out. There are a lot of and what we're seeing is folks coming in and buying up the properties, just buying lands and speculating like they've done all over New Orleans. And what we're seeing in Brazil and what we're seeing literally in Cuba, even with the threats that there is, what we've seen in London is this right-wing rise that is scary, and it's scary particularly because I think of climate change. Because before we would think about, okay, how do we manage and how do we have the 1,000-yard stare? How do we manage? But right now we're talking about the Supreme Court. We're talking about the fact that the climate is changing really rapidly, and it feels pretty apocalyptic for us. And it's happening all over the world. My cousin lives in London, and he says that things have become unaffordable, that the tensions are unbelievable, that the economy is just tanking really quickly. And so we're seeing this happen, and it seems to be like a global phenomena. And so you all have a lot of power. I don't know if you realize how much power you have. You know, one of the things I've always said is that all these new groups who say that youth are leading now, youth have always led. Black Panthers were youth, Young Lords were youth, the Brown Berets were youth, the folks who fought against the war were young people, Civil Rights Movement were youth, Black Lives Matter were youth. Young people have always led, and they've always been in their power. And so this is a moment for you to really understand that and not just think about your careers, because you're not going to have them in 20 years if you're not doing something right now to change everything up. Because this is global. And I think that the United States always has an influence on folks all over the world. And if they saw the kind of groundswell of activism and rebellion in this country that needs to happen, given the size of the threat, I think the world would basically stand with us. So But I don't know if I'm answering your question because I think I'm just a little overwhelmed by the size of it all. Anybody all the way in the back? Nobody? Okay, yeah.
I'm Kenzie. I'm Ecology, Evolution, Biodiversity Junior. I have a question about your intergenerational leadership tactics because when I was a kid, my parents would always bring me to stuff like marches and like sleep-ins and stuff, but I didn't really realize what I was like involved in. I didn't understand the issues when I was a kid. So how do you start talking to kids about these really complex issues, and what is the role of your youth leaders in your organization?
So we don't infantilize young people. Young people are always, a lot is expected of them, but we infantilize them. And then this is a country that really expects young people to lead, but then doesn't want to give them any power. It's only in this country where generations are pitted against each other. And I think it's extractive, and I think it's capitalist for generations to fight for each other for power. You know, like you got to move these. I mean, I've read articles about people, like elders, having to be, that they should move them out of the way because now, you know, millennials want jobs. And I'm like, wow, really? So I talked to my millennial son about that. He's like, Mom, don't listen to them. I think we have, one of the things I talk about is that one of our organizers started with us when she was 12, and she's our lead climate justice organizer. That on our board of directors, one of our members started when he was 14, and he's now getting a double master's on sustainable development from Cornell. These are all young people of color, and we never think of them as being at risk. We think of them as being at potential because we were them once. You know, people had deficit-based expectations of us too, you know, when we were growing up. And so we were told, you can't get into college, you can't get into law school, you can't. For me, being told that I couldn't was the best thing that you could tell me while I was growing up, because it was an act of defiance just to pursue an education for me. For our young people, really important that they be integrated into leadership early on, that they be given opportunities for them to stretch and see that they can do these things. But that they also understand their history. And for young people of color, it's one, seeing themselves in leadership, and also understanding what their history is in this country and globally. So for example, at our organization, it's not unusual for us to ask people who their people are, because who people's people are is important to us. So if you've got a group of about 20 young people and one of them is Egyptian, there'll be something in the curriculum about Egypt, because we want to celebrate that and we want to show some of the commonalities. The other thing is talking about the things that we have in common. So we talk a lot about the African diaspora. In New York, it's a little easier because you got people from the Caribbean and you've got people from throughout the African diaspora, and they need to know how they're connected to each other. Even doing role playing, like we did one on racial violence where we had a Dominican, a Puerto Rican, an African American, and no one in the room knew what they were. And then we had a police incident, and we said, okay, what were they? They're like, black. I said, yeah, that's right. So that's what they saw. And all of a sudden, they got out of their head of being African American, Dominican, and Puerto Rican. They understood that, wow, this is the way that the world is processing us. And that united them. You have to be creative. And you have to also listen to people's body language. So if you're doing something with young people and they've checked out, don't do it, you know? And you also have to incorporate culture, and you have to incorporate the arts. And so for us, you know, people act like hip hop just started the other day, but it didn't. Hip hop is over 40 now. All right. And I know because my brother was with Rock Steady early on, and he was a graffiti writer. And my brother just said to me the other day, we're getting old. I was like, yeah. So, but spoken word, poetry, painting, our young people are tremendously creative. And our young people are brilliant and not patronizing young people. I was testifying in front of Congress about, I guess last week or the week before, and there was a 16-year-old who was there from 0 Hour. And we were the only 2 women of color on the panel. And the congressional representatives kept talking about how great it was that there was a young person at the panel. Oh my God, oh, I feel so bad, oh this, oh that. But they never asked her a question. She was just like a planted plant, she was just like a pot sitting there, no questions. And me, as a mother of color, as someone that works with young people and whose life has been radically changed from just working with them in a way that has made me sharper and more powerful, I just wanted her to stand on top of the desk and take the mic and snatch it and disrupt the whole thing. And I wanted to say to her, and I got your back. They accused me of disrupting twice. And I did it only because they had given all the attention to the Republicans, and they basically were trying to marginalize us, And so I felt for her the way that we should be feeling about our young people, like we've got their back, and that we're next to them, and that we're in front of them, and that we're like this with each other, right? But creating an environment where you honestly are learning from each other and not patronizing young people is important. So that means disagreeing with them. They're not always right. They're not. Just like we're not always right. And they don't have brilliant ideas all the freaking time, just like we don't have brilliant ideas all the time. And so it's really creating an opportunity where you basically have a table where everyone is at it and you're respecting each other. And sometimes they lead, and sometimes you lead, and sometimes we lead together. It is a culture. It is a culture, and it evolved at our organization over time. When it started was, we had this 12-year-old who walked in. I had just started. The organization had no funding, and she walked in and said, "What do you do here?" And I said, I'm the facilitator of your dreams. What do you want to do? She's like, "Well, teach me what you know." I was like, "Okay, I got you. Fill the place up with young people, and I'll teach you how to organize." And then after they learned how to organize, I asked, "So what do you think is important?" They said, "Well, they're going to expand the Gowanus Expressway, and we're concerned about that. The community is in a lead belt, and the local elected official is voting against lead paint abatement." They were able to tell me, at the time I had no staff, what they thought was important. And I remember fighting for a park, for open space, because I thought that was important to them, because we had a quarter acre of open space for every 1,000 people living in the neighborhood, and 1/3 of the community was under the age of 19. We had high levels of asthma and obesity and diabetes, and so I thought open space was a priority. They wanted to fight the siting of a power plant. And so we stopped and started to fight the siting of the power plant. And so for them to do that, it meant that they needed to understand the grid. They needed to understand how that operated. And they needed to be able to have all their talking points and do all their research so that they could testify at the hearings and educate the community. That meant they had to learn that stuff. They needed to know how to communicate it. And they had to do the research. And the average age was 15. And they defeated the siting of a power plant that was the size of 3 football fields, 520 megawatt power plant. They defeated that. And they were kids from around the block. We don't cream, so it's not like we pick the kids that are doing really well academically and then say, "Look how badass we are." No, we think our people are at potential, so we take the most marginalized, the most neglected, and we let them know that they have power. So we've sent Fort Antarctica on scientific expeditions and 2 to the North Pole. And so everywhere in New York City where people get to participate in that program, it's a principal who picks the A student. In Brooklyn, I get to pick that person. And I don't pick the A student, but the person I pick becomes an A student, right? Because they know their power. And they know that when they don't step up and honor their ancestors, that they're basically giving power to somebody else to determine where they live, how much they get paid, and if they get paid at all. That they're basically giving up power. And so the other thing is that as the ED, despite everything I do and everywhere I go, I know everything that happens in the life of every single young person that comes through Uprose. Because they mattered to me. And they mattered to me because somebody cared about me because of how I grew up. So the other thing, and this is the reason I say they have to see themselves in leadership. What that means is that as a white woman, you can't be delivering this message to black youth. And I say that with all due respect, right? So my mother, I remember telling me, "You need to put all your awards up on the wall." I was like, "No." "You need to put all your degrees on the wall." I was like, "No." "You need to get dressed up." I'm like, "No." And she said, "You got to do it so they see, so it forces the question, how did you do that?" And so I did it, and it did. They were like, What happened? How did you grow up? What was that like? What was it like living in the South Bronx when it was burning? Wow, so your dad was a junkie. How did you end up a lawyer? Those were the questions they asked once I put those things up on the wall. They need to see themselves in leadership. And seeing themselves in leadership doesn't mean that you hire a staffer to work with the young people, but the leadership is still white. Leadership is leadership. That means on the board of directors, people making decisions that have power. They need to see that. And I have to say that because people have good intentions, right? My husband says the path to good intentions, what? The road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? So it really is knowing how to use your privilege in a way that honors the fact that maybe you're not the one, but that you may have doors that you can open, and there may be other ways that you can provide support that make it possible for that institution or those people in those positions to help them fly. So I can go on because I've been doing this for a really long time, and mostly what I do, I learn from them. If they're bored, they tell you. If they're disengaged, they tell you. And it's our responsibility to push them. And this thing about the ancestors is no joke. The fact is that our ancestors went through a lot so that we would have power today, and that they literally need to stand in their power. And so they need to know that. And that's without talking to them about religion or anything like that. So all of that, if you come into Uprose, you feel it. It's on the walls. Like everybody's history is on the walls. Everybody's flag is on the walls. All the things that are important to our community are on the walls. So even visually, that's important, right? You go into a place that looks really sort of Eurocentric, and you feel like you're in a hospital, or you feel like you're in another place. They literally have to walk into a place that feels like home, and home in a spiritual and cultural way. And that only happens through the arts, through music, through all the things that make us us. So that's my long answer, I'm sorry. But it is something that's really important to me, which is why I go on a long time, because I believe that I wouldn't be here right now if somebody hadn't done that for me, if somebody hadn't helped me understand that I had power. And, and I feel that power. Yes. I'm sorry? Somebody over here on the left? Come on, there's nobody on the left? What?
Hi, my name is Brianna. I'm a second-year master's student, and I really appreciate you being here and just bringing this conversation to light. I'm curious to know, in thinking about community organizing and advocacy work and kind of leveraging the power that's in this room to share knowledge and resources, how do you feel like the community's risk perception of climate change changes when you share information about things that they experience in their daily life and how those connect to climate change, for instance, like asthma, and how that's exacerbated by climate change? Do you feel like this engages them more, or do you have communication strategies that are really salient and you feel like have been successful in the community?
So I think our communities know that climate change is a problem. I think our communities know that. I think that if our communities have to work 2 or 3 jobs, come home to take care of the children, and then go to a meeting, that's hard. And that often when they go, it's because it affects them personally. And they kind of think that climate change is something a little further along, but they know it's a thing. In a privileged community, you have the nanny that lives in our neighborhood taking care of the kids so that they could go to a climate meeting. And then people making judgments about where our people aren't engaged, right? So what we do is we provide childcare, we provide food, we're available when the community's available, whether that's a Saturday afternoon or 8 o'clock in the morning to meet with a bunch of parents, because that's when they can meet right before school starts. And we have to be really nimble and available to make people engage. But I can tell you that I have not met a single person in my community who doesn't think that climate change isn't real. Everyone does. I have not met the one. But I know that there are parts in this country where people don't think that. And that's where I think you should go. Which reminds me that we have been here for a minute, and I think I only heard a question from one person of color, and that just breaks my heart. So I don't know if you guys are just sitting taking it in. I don't know if you got no rhythm for me. I don't know what's going on, but you haven't said a word. I look over there, I look at the sisters over there. You know, I come from Brooklyn, by the way, with the largest Palestinian community, you know, right across the street, the largest Muslim school. I'm looking you over there, I'm looking over there. I'm like, what? Are you quiet like that in class too? Do you not speak in class? Okay. Anyway, I just wanted to say that because learning, just like learning happens across generations, it also happens by people stepping up and feeling like they can take that mic and being confident with it. So, any other comments? Not to make anybody else who wanted to speak not speak. It was just that I realized that, you know, only the brother in the front spoke, and I was like, where are my people at? All right. Yes. Okay, now we're talking. Go ahead. Go ahead. Stand up.
Hey. So I'm Jerry Ann Hebron from Detroit, and I'm with the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm, involved in the urban ag movement. I just have a comment, and it really speaks to the question about the generational leadership. And we saw that need in the work that we do in Detroit because there's so much development, so much work being done around social justice, environmental justice, and climate change justice. But a lot of the folks at the table were like me, old. And so we needed to get the younger people at the tables, in the rooms where we're talking with the city and government and developers, and, you know, giving the mic to the young people so that we can hear from them and get them involved in that movement. So with that question, for us, what we're doing is making sure that the young people are in the room and a part of those conversations.
Thank you for that. I will say that there's a way of thinking about intergenerational as youth and elder, as if there's nobody in the middle. And we got a lot of 30-somethings who think they're youth. They actually think that. And when they think they're youth, what that means is that they're basically not being accountable, because with age comes that accountability. And so they get to be in the room with people who really are youth, you know, who are like 20, 16, 15, 12, 10. And so I think that's abusive. I think we need to sort of accept the fact that if you're in your 30s and your 40s, let it go, right? There's all these people in the middle, so it's like elders, and then there's youth. And I'm like, when did being an adult not stop being a thing, right? So the reason I say that to you is that sometimes it's not us who delivers the message. Sometimes it's somebody who's 5 years older, 10 years older, and then they can hear it. But if we're fully intergenerational and we've got people at different ages working with each other, you really do have a complexity of solutions and approaches that is really different, because every generation has values and a perspective that is specific to that generation and is important to the community building process. And so once you have that divide where you got elders and young people, then you're missing all of this in the middle. And then it's no longer, then leadership is no longer a continuum. The other thing that I want to add based on what you said is that it's not about giving young people the mic. We also have to train them. We need to train them. We need to train them how to testify, how to do the research. They need to know that the minute they take the mic, that it's not what they think, that they're accountable. That they're accountable to somebody, to a base. That just because they have an opinion doesn't mean that that's enough. If they're talking to each other as we're talking to each other, that's one thing. But when you're actually representing people, you're accountable. And that comes with training. So we do 7 weeks of training, leadership training, where we're training about environmental justice, organizing. We put them through different routines on organizing where we challenge all kinds. We turn the entire building into an organizing thing where we play security. We take that stuff really seriously. It's so fun. And they're like, and they get terrified because, you know, sometimes they start really acting like an oppressor. And we're taking notes. We're not saying a word. We're just taking notes and then deconstructing that. So they're trained. And they're also brought into leadership at different intervals, right? So like youngest do air monitoring, right? The older ones are the ones that are going out to the protests, that are learning how to do direct action. So they literally move into more and more responsibilities and more complexity into in the terms of their organizing skills. But they, just like we learned it, they have to learn it too. And that comes with the infantilized, oh, let's hear what the young person has to say, right? We do that. Really? Or we have a youth program, or we create a youth track where only young people are only talking to young people as if somehow we're not going to learn something from that, right? And we see that happening all the time, where young people are just marginalized and put in a box, and we have this structure called youth programming. I don't even know what that is. We can have a staff meeting, and they'll walk straight out of school right into the staff meeting with opinions, because they've been such an integral part of decision-making and leadership that they have opinions that matter to us. And for them to be able to see that an opinion that they have ends up as being part of a campaign or being something that changes the direction that we're going is a really powerful thing. And that's not just like, you know, oh, let's just do it because the young people had an idea. No, that is a good idea. Let's do that. So I think that people need to be mindful about what the deficits are, because here's the thing. We are constantly thinking that this is going to benefit young people. This is going to benefit us. We're smarter, we're sharper, we're better organizers. We know how to use social media platforms. We know how to message. We know how to create a meme. We know how to put out a powerful message in 140 characters. We know how to do all kinds of things because young people are in the room. We're better organizers because of them. So it's not going in one direction. It's not like, okay, let's save the young people because they're at risk. Let's make them stronger. As a community, we're all stronger, we're more brilliant, we're more on point because we're in the room with each other. So even the way we think about power has to change. They make us more powerful. I know I talk a lot. I'm sorry, you could cut me off. Just go like this. My son does it to me all the time.
Well, we'll end on that all of you in this room, especially those that are under 30, have a lot of power that you need to exert more. If you were too quiet and you wish you had finally asked a question, come on up and talk to Elizabeth in person just after we end. Let's thank her again for her visit.
Thank you. Thank you.